Jake's new workshop was larger than any space he had worked in since leaving Earth, but it felt cramped compared to the massive engineering bays where the main reconstruction efforts took place. Counselor Vexra had given him access to basic equipment and materials, but with strict limitations on what he could build and how he could build it. The conservative Vorthak engineers were watching his every move and waiting for him to fail, so they could end this embarrassing experiment with primitive human methods. The junior technicians assigned to help Jake were nervous about working with an alien slave. They had been taught from childhood that Vorthak engineering methods were perfect, and that any deviation from established protocols was dangerous and wasteful. Jake could see the doubt in their glowing eyes every time he suggested doing something differently from the traditional approach. They followed his instructions, but he could tell they expected his project to end in disaster. Jake decided to start with a medium-scale prototype that would be large enough to demonstrate his principles clearly, but small enough to build within his resource limitations. His design used modular components that could be easily assembled and modified, rather than the massive permanent structures that the main reconstruction teams preferred. Each module contained its own adaptive control systems and could function independently, even if other parts of the system failed. The first major challenge came when Jake requested materials that the Vorthak considered inferior or defective. The supply technicians couldn't understand why he wanted quantum crystals with natural flaws when perfect specimens were available. Jake tried to explain his theory about harmonic variations, but the concept was so foreign to Vorthak, thinking that most of them dismissed it as primitive superstition. Jake had to demonstrate his point by building two identical resonance chambers, one using perfect crystals and one using intentionally flawed specimens. When he activated both chambers under controlled conditions, the perfect crystal system immediately began showing signs of instability, while the flawed crystal system maintained steady resonance patterns. The demonstration convinced his technician team, but the supply department still required special authorization from Counselor Vexra before they would provide the imperfect materials Jake needed. Working with the junior technicians turned out to be more educational than Jake had expected. Their fresh perspectives and willingness to question established methods reminded Jake of his own early days as an engineer. The youngest technician, Corthan, was especially eager to learn about human engineering principles and often stayed late to help Jake work on difficult problems. Corthan's curiosity and enthusiasm began to influence the other team members, and soon they were all experimenting with adaptive approaches. The most controversial aspect of Jake's design was his insistence on building redundancy and failure tolerance into every system. Vorthak engineering philosophy assumed that properly designed components would never fail, so backup systems were considered wasteful and unnecessary. Jake had to explain over and over again that in human engineering, everything eventually broke down and systems needed to be designed to keep working even when individual parts failed. Jake's breakthrough came when he successfully demonstrated a small-scale wormhole generator that could maintain stable operation for over an hour. The achievement was remarkable not just because it worked, but because it continued working even after Jake deliberately damaged several key components. The adaptive control systems automatically compensated for the failures and maintained stable operation by redistributing the load to undamaged modules. Word of Jake's success spread quickly through the Vorthak engineering community and created a massive controversy. Conservative factions demanded that the experiment be terminated immediately, because allowing primitive aliens to influence Vorthak technology was an insult to their cultural heritage. They argued that Jake's methods were crude shortcuts that might work temporarily, but would never achieve the perfection that Vorthak engineering demanded. The progressive factions led by Counselor Vexra pointed out that 3 centuries of traditional methods had produced nothing but failure, while Jake's approach had achieved measurable progress in just a few months. They argued that the Vorthak had become so focused on theoretical perfection that they had forgotten how to build practical solutions to real problems. The debate raged through the highest levels of Vorthak society and even reached the attention of the planetary government. Jake found himself caught in the middle of a cultural war that had been brewing in Vorthak society for generations. Younger engineers were excited by his innovative approaches and eager to experiment with human methods. The older engineers saw his work as a threat to everything they believed about technological superiority and proper engineering discipline. Both sides tried to use Jake's project to support their own political agendas. Despite the political pressure, Jake continued working on scaling up his prototype to full array size. The modular design philosophy that seemed so strange to the Vorthak actually made the scaling process much easier than traditional approaches. Instead of having to rebuild everything from scratch at a larger size, Jake could simply manufacture more modules and connect them using standardized interfaces. The construction process revealed new advantages of Jake's human approach that even he hadn't anticipated. When manufacturing defects created variations between supposedly identical modules, the adaptive control systems automatically adjusted to compensate for the differences. This meant that Jake's array could be built using mass production techniques, rather than the handcrafted precision manufacturing that Vorthak methods required. Jake also discovered that his modular approach made the array much easier to maintain and upgrade than the original design had been. Individual modules could be removed and replaced without shutting down the entire system. New modules with improved capabilities could be added to enhance performance over time. The array could literally evolve and grow rather than remaining frozen in its original configuration. The conservative engineers tried to sabotage Jake's project by imposing additional restrictions and safety requirements that would have made construction impossible, but Counselor Vexra intervened each time and provided Jake with the resources he needed to continue. The old engineer seemed genuinely interested in seeing whether human methods could succeed where Vorthak approaches had failed. As construction progressed, Jake began training his technician team to think like human engineers. He taught them to look for simple solutions to complex problems and to embrace imperfection as a tool, rather than a flaw. He showed them how to build systems that could adapt to changing conditions rather than requiring perfect environmental control. Most importantly, he taught them that good engineering was about solving problems rather than demonstrating technological superiority. The transformation in his team was remarkable to watch. Corthan and the other junior technicians began suggesting their own improvements to Jake's design and finding creative ways to solve construction challenges. They started thinking about engineering as a collaborative process rather than following rigid hierarchical procedures. Their enthusiasm began to influence other young Vorthak engineers who visited the workshop to observe Jake's methods. 6 months after starting his project, Jake was ready for the final test of his full-scale Nexus array prototype. The conservative engineers had prepared detailed analysis of why the test would fail and what punishments should be imposed when it did. The progressive engineers had staked their political careers on Jake's success and would face severe consequences if his approach didn't work. Jake himself tried not to think about what would happen to him if the array exploded during activation. The test was scheduled to take place in front of the full Vorthak High Council, with representatives from across their civilization in attendance. Jake spent the night before the test, checking and rechecking every system while his technician team worked beside him making final adjustments. They all knew that this moment would determine not just the fate of the array project, but the future relationship between humans and the Vorthak Confederation. The morning of the test arrived with unusual silence throughout the Vorthak orbital facility. Jake woke early and spent an hour going through his final checklist, while his stomach churned with nervous energy. Today would either prove that human engineering could solve problems that Vorthak science couldn't handle, or it would end with Jake facing severe punishment for wasting their time and resources. There was no middle ground left. Corthan and the other junior technicians arrived at the workshop looking as nervous as Jake felt. They had all invested months of their careers in this project, and failure would probably mean reassignment to menial positions far from the advanced engineering work they loved. But they also shared Jake's excitement about the possibility of proving that their new approach could work, where traditional methods had failed for 3 centuries. The Vorthak High Council began arriving at the observation platform 2 hours before the scheduled test. Jake could see them through the workshop windows as their transport ships docked with the orbital facility. Each counselor was accompanied by teams of advisors and technical experts who would analyze every aspect of the test and report back to their respective factions. The political stakes were enormous, and everyone involved knew it. Counselor Vexra, visited Jake's workshop one final time before the test began. The old engineer examined the array components with obvious interest and asked detailed questions about how the adaptive control systems would respond to various failure scenarios. Jake could tell that Vexra genuinely understood the principles behind the human approach and appreciated the elegance of solutions that worked through flexibility rather than rigid perfection. "Your design is unlike anything we have built in my lifetime," Vexra said as he studied the modular resonance chambers. "If it works, it will change how our people think about engineering forever. If it fails, the conservative factions will use that failure to prevent any future innovation." The weight of responsibility in his words made Jake realize just how much was riding on the next few hours. Jake spent the final hour before the test walking through the array with his technician team and verifying that every system was ready for activation. The modular design meant that dozens of independent subsystems had to coordinate perfectly to create the stable wormhole effect they were aiming for. Each module contained its own adaptive algorithms, but they all had to work together as a unified whole. The test began with Jake activating the primary power systems and bringing the quantum resonance chambers online one by one. The Vorthak observers watched their instruments carefully as energy levels climbed toward the critical thresholds needed for space-time manipulation. Jake could hear nervous murmuring from the observation platform as readings approached levels that had caused previous reconstruction attempts to fail catastrophically. But Jake's array behaved differently from the traditional designs. Instead of building toward a single critical activation point, the modular systems came online gradually and began establishing harmonic resonance patterns that grew stronger as more modules joined the network. The adaptive control algorithms automatically adjusted timing and frequency to maintain stability as the system scaled up to full power. The first sign that something special was happening came when the array achieved stable resonance at power levels that had always caused immediate failure in previous attempts. The quantum field readings showed harmonic patterns that the Vorthak had never seen before, complex but stable oscillations that seemed to strengthen rather than destabilize as energy levels increased. The conservative engineers checked their instruments repeatedly, unable to believe what they were seeing. Jake watched his control displays as the array approached the final activation threshold. The adaptive algorithms were working perfectly, compensating for minor variations between modules and maintaining overall system stability, even as individual components operated at their maximum capacity. The human approach of embracing imperfection and building in flexibility was proving its worth in ways that Jake had hoped for, but never dared to expect. The moment of wormhole activation was almost anticlimactic after the dramatic buildup. Instead of the violent energy release that characterized previous attempts, Jake's array simply opened a stable portal in space-time that looked like a shimmering window to somewhere else. The wormhole was perfectly round and completely stable, showing none of the fluctuations and distortions that had plagued earlier reconstruction efforts. The Vorthak observers stood in stunned silence as instrument readings confirmed what their eyes were telling them. Jake's array had not just succeeded in creating a wormhole, it had created one that was more stable and energy efficient than the original Nexus array had ever been. The harmonic resonance patterns were so smooth and consistent that the system could probably maintain operation indefinitely without manual intervention. But the real surprise came in the hours that followed as Jake's adaptive algorithms began optimizing themselves based on operational experience. The array started discovering new resonance patterns that increased efficiency and extended range beyond what Jake had programmed into the original design. The system was literally learning and improving itself in real time, evolving toward configurations that no engineer had ever imagined. Within 6 hours of activation, Jake's array was operating at twice its designed efficiency and opening wormholes to distances that exceeded the capabilities of the original Nexus array. The adaptive algorithms had found ways to use the harmonic variations between imperfect components to create resonance effects that pure components could never achieve. Jake's theory about embracing imperfection had been proven in the most dramatic way possible. The political impact was immediate and overwhelming. Conservative engineers who had spent decades insisting that only traditional methods could work were forced to admit that a primitive human had solved their greatest technological challenge using approaches they had dismissed as inferior. Progressive factions celebrated vindication of their arguments that Vorthak society needed to embrace new ideas and methods. Councillor Vexra made the formal announcement that Jake would be granted full Vorthak citizenship and offered the position of Chief Innovation Engineer for the Confederation. But Jake surprised everyone by declining the prestigious appointment and instead requesting something that no one had expected. He wanted to establish an exchange program between humanity and the Vorthak Confederation that would allow engineers from both species to learn from each other. Jake's reasoning was simple but profound. Human engineering had succeeded where Vorthak methods failed because humans had been forced to develop adaptive approaches by their limited resources and imperfect technology. But Jake also recognized that Vorthak science had capabilities that humans couldn't match, and that both species could benefit from sharing their different perspectives on problem solving. The exchange program that Jake proposed would send human engineers to work with Vorthak teams on advanced projects, while Vorthak engineers would visit Earth to study human approaches to engineering challenges. Both species would learn from each other and develop new hybrid methods that combined the best aspects of each civilization's technological philosophy. The High Council approved Jake's proposal unanimously, recognizing that the human engineer had already proven the value of cross-species collaboration. Plans were immediately begun for the first exchange missions that would establish formal diplomatic and technological relationships between humanity and the Vorthak Confederation. Jake stood on the observation platform, watching ships from across the galaxy use the wormholes his array was creating and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had not just rebuilt what aliens couldn't repair, he had shown them a new way to think about engineering itself. The array continued to evolve and improve, becoming more capable with each passing day as its adaptive algorithms discovered new possibilities. The success of Jake's project became a symbol throughout the galaxy that innovation came not from rigid adherence to established methods, but from the willingness to try new approaches and learn from different perspectives. Engineering students from dozens of species would eventually study Jake's work as an example of how embracing imperfection and building in adaptability could lead to solutions that surpassed anything achieved through traditional pursuit of theoretical perfection. Years later, when Jake returned to Earth as humanity's first ambassador to the Vorthak Confederation, he would often reflect on the lessons he had learned during those months of desperate experimentation in his tiny workshop. Sometimes the most advanced solution wasn't the most complex one, and sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem was to stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be practical. Jake had been collecting small pieces of equipment and materials for 2 months now, hiding them in his sleeping area whenever the Vorthak guards weren't watching. Building anything without permission was strictly forbidden, but Jake couldn't help himself. Every day he watched the alien engineers make the same mistakes over and over again while the solution seemed so obvious to his human mind. He had to at least try to prove that his ideas could work. The hardest part was getting access to the materials he needed without anyone noticing. Jake had learned to time his collection efforts with the shift changes when the supervision was lightest. He would grab small components that looked broken or discarded and hide them under his work clothes. The Vorthak threw away materials that Jake knew could still be useful with a little creative modification. Jake's sleeping area was a small metal room with no windows, and barely enough space for the simple bed they had given him. The walls were made of some kind of alien alloy that Jake couldn't identify, but it seemed strong enough to contain any small explosions that might result from his experiments. Jake worked by the light of a small portable lamp that he had managed to repair, using techniques the Vorthak would never have considered. The Vorthak engineering philosophy was based on using perfect components in perfect configurations to achieve perfect results. Jake's human approach was the complete opposite. He believed that good engineering meant making imperfect components work together reliably, even when conditions were far from ideal. Human technology had developed this way because Earth had limited resources and human engineers had to make do with whatever materials they could find. Jake's first breakthrough came when he realized that the quantum crystals the Vorthak insisted on using were actually too pure for the array to work properly. The original builders had probably used crystals with natural flaws that created harmonic variations in the quantum field. These variations were essential for preventing the cascade failures that kept destroying the reconstruction attempts. Jake spent weeks carefully damaging some of the discarded crystals he had collected, creating controlled flaws that would produce the harmonic patterns he needed. It was delicate work because too much damage would make the crystals useless, while too little damage wouldn't create the right effects. Jake had to rely on his instincts and experience rather than precise measurements because he didn't have access to the advanced testing equipment the Vorthak used. The second major insight came when Jake realized that the array's control systems needed to be adaptive rather than rigid. The Vorthak were trying to program exact sequences that would work perfectly under ideal conditions, but Jake knew that real-world conditions were never ideal, and systems needed to be able to adjust to unexpected changes. Human computers had been designed this way from the beginning, because human programmers knew that users would always find ways to break their software. Jake began writing simple adaptive algorithms using a basic programming interface he had found in one of the damaged Vorthak devices. The interface was primitive compared to their main systems, but it was powerful enough for Jake's purposes. He created programs that could monitor the quantum resonance patterns and automatically adjust the system parameters to maintain stability, even when components failed or conditions changed. Building the physical prototype was the most challenging, part because Jake had to work with tools and materials that were designed for alien hands and alien engineering principles. The Vorthak tools were incredibly precise, but they were also inflexible. Jake had to modify them extensively to work with his human approach to engineering. He used techniques he had learned maintaining human starships where equipment was always breaking down and replacement parts were never exactly right. Jake's prototype was tiny compared to the massive scale of the original array, but it contained all the essential elements of his design. He used a network of flawed crystals connected by adaptive resonance controllers that could adjust their frequency patterns in real time. The whole system was designed to be robust rather than perfect, capable of continuing to function even when individual components failed. The first test almost ended in disaster when Jake's homemade safety systems failed to contain the quantum field properly. The explosion was small but loud enough that Jake worried the guards might investigate. He spent the next week improving his containment protocols and making sure his next attempt would be safer. Jake couldn't afford to be discovered before he had a chance to prove his theories. The second test was more successful but still didn't achieve the stable wormhole effect that Jake was aiming for. The quantum resonance was there, but it wasn't strong enough to actually bend space-time. Jake realized he needed better power regulation and more sophisticated timing controls. He spent another month refining his design and rebuilding key components with materials that were closer to what he actually needed. Jake's breakthrough finally came during his fourth test, when everything suddenly clicked into place. The adaptive algorithms found the right resonance patterns, and the flawed crystals created exactly the harmonic variations that Jake had predicted. For 37 seconds, Jake's tiny prototype created a stable micro-wormhole that connected 2 points in space. It was only a few inches across, but it was unmistakably real. Jake sat in his small room staring at his prototype and feeling a mixture of triumph and terror. He had just proven that his human approach to engineering could solve a problem that had stumped the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. But he also knew that the Vorthak would never accept this achievement from a primitive slave species. They would probably destroy his prototype and punish him severely for unauthorized experimentation. The next morning, Jake made a decision that would change everything. During the daily work briefing, he waited until Zeftal finished explaining the latest reconstruction attempt and then raised his hand. The other Vorthak engineers looked at him with surprise because slaves were not supposed to speak during technical discussions. Zeftal's skin patterns flashed with annoyance as he acknowledged Jake's request to speak. Jake took a deep breath and began explaining his observations about the reconstruction failures. He pointed out the problems with using perfect components and rigid control systems. He described his theory about harmonic variations and adaptive algorithms. Most importantly, he told them about his successful prototype test and offered to demonstrate his approach. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Several Vorthak engineers began shouting at Jake in their own language while others demanded that he be punished for his insolence. Zeftal's skin flashed through angry color patterns as he ordered Jake to return to his menial duties and never speak out of turn again. The whole briefing dissolved into chaos as the engineers argued about whether Jake should be executed or just severely punished. But one voice cut through the arguing and brought the room to silence. Counselor Vexra was one of the oldest and most respected Vorthak engineers, and his presence at the daily briefing was unusual. He had been listening to Jake's explanation with obvious interest, and now he stepped forward to address the room directly. Vexra spoke slowly and clearly, so that Jake's translation device could keep up with his words. He said that Jake's observations were interesting and deserved serious consideration rather than immediate dismissal. He pointed out that 300 years of traditional approaches had failed to rebuild the array, and perhaps it was time to consider alternative methods. He ordered Zeftal to give Jake access to proper equipment and materials so that he could demonstrate his theories on a larger scale. The other engineers were shocked by this decision, but none of them dared to argue with Counselor Vexra. Jake found himself suddenly promoted from slave laborer to experimental engineer with his own workshop and a small team of junior Vorthak technicians to assist him. It was everything he had hoped for and more than he had dared to expect. Jake had been working in the Vorthak industrial complex for 3 weeks now, and every day felt like a nightmare that wouldn't end. The alien beings who had captured him were unlike anything he had ever imagined. They stood nearly 8 feet tall, with bodies that looked like they were made from living crystal. Their skin changed colors when they moved, and their multiple arms ended in hands that could split into dozens of tiny fingers when they needed to work with delicate equipment. The Vorthak called themselves the masters of this part of the galaxy, and Jake was beginning to understand why. Their technology was so advanced that it seemed like magic to human eyes. They had machines that could reshape matter at the molecular level and computers that seemed to think for themselves. Their cities floated in the air without any visible means of support, and their vehicles moved through space without engines that Jake could identify. But despite all their amazing technology, the Vorthak had one problem they couldn't solve. The Nexus array had been destroyed 300 years ago in a war with their enemies, and they couldn't figure out how to rebuild it. Jake had been assigned to work on the reconstruction project as basically a slave laborer. His job was to carry tools and clean up after the real engineers, while they tried to recreate something that had been the greatest achievement of their civilization. Jake's supervisor was a Vorthak engineer named Zeftal, who treated him like a barely intelligent animal. Zeftal would give Jake orders in the Vorthak language, and then get angry when Jake didn't understand exactly what he wanted. The translation device they had given Jake only worked for basic words and concepts. Complex technical discussions were almost impossible to follow. The reconstruction site was a massive orbital platform floating above the planet where Jake had crashed. Getting there required riding in a Vorthak transport that made Jake feel sick every time they used it. The artificial gravity systems worked differently from human technology, and Jake's inner ear couldn't adjust to the strange sensations. He usually spent the first hour of each workday feeling dizzy and nauseous. The array itself had been enormous when it was working. Jake could see the twisted remains of structures that must have been miles long floating in organized chaos around the platform. The Vorthak engineers worked with incredible precision as they tried to recreate sections of the original design. They used holographic blueprints that showed every detail of the array's construction, down to the atomic level. But every attempt to rebuild the array ended in failure. Jake watched as team after team of engineers would spend weeks constructing a section only to have it explode or simply not work when they tried to activate it. The Vorthak would analyze the failure for days and then start over with slight modifications. Jake began to realize that they had been repeating this process for decades without making any real progress. What puzzled Jake the most was how rigid the Vorthak approach seemed to be. They followed their ancient blueprints exactly without any deviation or experimentation. When equipment didn't work perfectly, they would rebuild it rather than trying to find alternative solutions. Jake had been trained as a human engineer to adapt and improvise when things went wrong. The Vorthak seemed incapable of thinking outside their established procedures. During his lunch breaks, Jake would sit alone and study the array's remains through the transport windows. He began to notice things that the Vorthak engineers seemed to miss. The original builders had clearly made modifications and improvements as they worked, Jake could see where sections had been rebuilt with different materials or where the design had been changed to solve unexpected problems. But the current engineers were trying to recreate only the final version, without understanding the process that had created it. Jake tried to point out these observations to Zeftal, but the alien engineer dismissed his comments as the confused ramblings of a primitive mind. The Vorthak believed that their ancestors had been perfect engineers who never made mistakes. The idea that the array might have been built through trial and error was offensive to their cultural beliefs about technological superiority. As the weeks passed, Jake began to see the fundamental flaw in the Vorthak reconstruction efforts. They were trying to copy perfection rather than understanding the principles that made the array work. Human engineers had learned long ago that the best solutions often came from embracing imperfection and finding ways to make flawed systems work reliably. The Vorthak had forgotten this lesson somewhere in their 10,000 years of technological advancement. Jake started sketching his own ideas during his rest periods, using materials he managed to steal from the worksite. His human perspective gave him insights that the Vorthak couldn't see. Where they demanded perfect quantum crystals, Jake imagined using networks of smaller, less perfect components that could work together. Where they insisted on exact mathematical precision, Jake envisioned systems that could adapt and self-correct when conditions changed. The more Jake studied the problem, the more convinced he became that the Vorthak were approaching it all wrong. They were trying to build a monument to their technological perfection rather than a functional tool that could actually work. Jake had grown up fixing human machines that were always breaking down and running out of parts. He knew how to make things work even when they weren't supposed to. One day, Jake watched as another reconstruction attempt failed in a spectacular explosion that destroyed weeks of work. The Vorthak engineers stood around analyzing the failure with their advanced instruments while Jake saw something they missed. The explosion had happened because they were using components that were too perfect. The quantum resonance had no way to dissipate excess energy because every part of the system was designed to work at exactly the same frequency. Jake realized that the original array had probably used intentionally imperfect components that created harmonic variations in the quantum field. These variations would have provided natural safety valves that prevented the kind of cascade failures he kept seeing in the reconstruction attempts. It was a brilliantly simple solution that the Vorthak couldn't see, because they thought imperfection was always a flaw to be eliminated. That night, Jake worked on his own design, using the sketching materials he had collected. His approach was completely different from the Vorthak method. Instead of trying to recreate the exact specifications of the original array, Jake designed a system that could achieve the same results through different means. His design used modular components that could be easily replaced and adaptive algorithms that could learn from experience. Jake knew his ideas would be rejected if he presented them directly to the Vorthak engineers. They would never accept suggestions from a primitive human who didn't even understand their basic technology. But Jake also knew that his approach could work, because it was based on principles that had served human engineers well for centuries. Sometimes the best way to solve a complex problem was to think about it in simple terms and build up from basic concepts. Jake decided he would have to find a way to prove his theories before anyone would listen to him. He began planning how he might build a small-scale prototype using materials he could access without permission. It would be dangerous because the Vorthak punished unauthorized experimentation severely, but Jake couldn't stand watching them fail over and over again when he could see a better way forward. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he worked frantically in the engine room of the human starship Horizon. Red warning lights flashed everywhere and alarm sirens screamed through the metal corridors. The ship was dying, and Jake knew it. He could feel the vibrations getting worse with each passing second as the main reactor fought against a cascade failure that would kill everyone on board. The Horizon was humanity's first real attempt at deep space exploration beyond their own solar system. Jake had been so proud when they selected him as the chief engineer for this mission. He was only 32 years old, but he had worked on starship engines since he was 18. His hands knew every bolt and wire in the ship's systems. Now, those same hands were desperately trying to save the lives of 237 crew members. Captain Ben Murphy's voice crackled through the communication system. "Jake, we need more time. The escape pods aren't ready yet." Jake could hear the fear in his captain's voice, even though the man was trying to stay calm. They had been investigating a strange energy reading near the Kepler 442 system when something had gone terribly wrong. The energy field had somehow damaged their main reactor in ways that Jake had never seen before. "I'm doing everything I can," Jake shouted back over the noise of the failing engines. "But this reactor is going to blow in maybe 10 minutes. You need to get those pods launched now." Jake's fingers moved quickly over the control panels as he tried to buy them more time. He knew he was fighting a losing battle, but he couldn't give up, not when so many lives depended on him. The reactor core was getting hotter by the minute, and Jake could see the radiation levels climbing to dangerous heights. He had already sealed off 3 sections of the engine room, but the damage was spreading, faster than he could contain it. The alien energy field had done something to their technology that human science didn't understand yet. Every safety system was failing at once. Jake heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez running into the engine room. She was the ship's second engineer and one of Jake's closest friends. "Jake, you need to leave now. The captain ordered everyone to the escape pods." Her face was pale with worry as she grabbed his arm. "I can't leave yet," Jake said as he continued working on the reactor controls. "If I can just stabilize the core for 5 more minutes, everyone will have time to get away safely. The pods need that long to reach minimum safe distance." Jake knew he was probably lying to himself, but he had to try. He had never left a job unfinished in his life, and he wasn't going to start now. Amy shook her head. "Jake, the captain says that's an order. We need to go right now." But even as she said it, Jake could see in her eyes that she understood why he couldn't leave. She had worked with him long enough to know that Jake would never abandon his post while people were still in danger. "Then go," Jake said quietly as he kept working. "Get to a pod and make sure you survive this. Someone needs to tell Earth what happened here." Jake tried to smile at his friend, but he could feel his hands shaking as the reactor core grew more unstable. The temperature readings were climbing into the red zone, and Jake knew he was running out of options. Amy stood there for another moment, and then nodded. "I'll tell them you were a hero," she said before turning and running back toward the escape pod bays. Jake watched her go and felt a strange sense of peace. He had always known that being an engineer in deep space might mean making this kind of choice someday. He just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. The next few minutes passed like hours, as Jake fought to keep the reactor from exploding. He could hear the escape pods launching one by one through the ship's communication system. Each launch meant more of his friends were safe, and that gave him the strength to keep working. The radiation levels were getting dangerous, but Jake ignored the warnings on his suit's display. With 30 seconds left on his countdown, Jake managed to implement an emergency containment protocol that would hold the reactor together just long enough for the last escape pod to reach safety. But the effort required him to manually override the safety systems from inside the reactor chamber itself. Jake knew this meant he wouldn't be able to get out in time, but the math was simple. His life for the lives of everyone else on the ship. Jake sealed himself into the reactor chamber and began the final shutdown sequence. Through the thick metal walls, he could hear the last escape pod launching. Captain Murphy's voice came through his helmet radio one last time. "Jake, if you can hear this, thank you. We'll never forget what you did here." Jake smiled as he activated the containment field and felt the reactor begin to stabilize. But something went wrong with the containment process, and instead of a controlled shutdown, the reactor created a massive energy pulse that tore through space and time itself. Jake felt himself being pulled into some kind of vortex as reality twisted around him. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was the strange feeling that he was being thrown across vast distances through space. When Jake woke up, he was lying in the wreckage of what looked like an escape pod that he didn't remember entering. The pod was smoking and damaged, and Jake could taste blood in his mouth. His engineering suit was torn and his helmet was cracked, but he was somehow still alive. Outside the pod's broken window, Jake could see an alien landscape under a purple sky with 2 moons hanging in the distance. Jake tried to stand up, but his legs felt weak and shaky. He managed to crawl out of the pod and onto solid ground that felt different from any planet he had ever imagined. The gravity was lighter than Earth's, and the air had a strange smell that made his nose burn. Jake looked back at his pod and realized it wasn't one of the Horizon's escape pods at all. It was something else entirely, made from materials he didn't recognize. Before Jake could figure out what had happened to him, he heard strange sounds coming from behind a group of tall crystalline trees. The sounds were getting closer, and Jake realized they were probably made by whatever lived on this alien world. Jake tried to hide behind his damaged pod, but he was too weak and injured to move very far. All he could do was wait and hope that whatever found him wouldn't immediately try to kill him.